big honor for me to be able to speak here a second time. I really appreciate the invitation. How many of you here when I spoke last time on April 2nd?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right, good. So, because I'm not going to repeat very much or close to very little, but this does sort of come on the foundation of that content. Today is like a weather report, so you might be disappointed because I'm not going to say anything about the future, just about what's going on right now. And this is a great big question that I had. Maybe as I was developing this research on history, I was really unable, without really digging into it, I really didn't know how to explain the current turbulence in our country. So I've been working on this subject for probably 2 years, reading a lot of books, listening to a lot of lectures, doing a lot of prayer, and I hope I've made some progress figuring it out. You might not agree or think I've explained this very carefully, but I hope that it does provide some insight on what's going on providentially in our country right now. The last time I was here, Higher Purpose Forum, the group that I'm leading, we now have a 2-day seminar that we present on American history, Race and Providence in America, and it has 8 sessions. And last time I was here, we did human origins and migration. I hope this sounds familiar. Tribalism and nation building, and then we ran through U.S. history and we got up to the civil rights era. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. Kind of? Okay. Today, so that's what we covered last time. Today I'm going to quickly touch on section 1, providential orientation, because this content doesn't really make sense if you don't believe in providence. There's an assumption in this presentation that people are listening accept the fact that there's a providence occurring. And so if, in a larger program, we would explain why we believe America is part of the providential story. And then today we're going to probably focus on understanding our present era. So I'm going to quickly review sessions 1 through 7, and then I'm going to talk today about understanding our present era, which is session 8, and I'm just going to make 5 points today. It's very hard to understand the providence, I think, unless you really have a clear sense of what I consider to be the core of what our true parents have revealed. The core truth of the principle. The essence upon which I think all other ideas of the principle build upon. The root. The reason I think that Father was so profound in his thinking is he figured this out and he built everything upon this one understanding. What do you think that understanding is?
Restoration.
Before restoration.
Ideal. The original ideal? Fall man.
No. The basic, now this is my opinion, the most basic fact that Father nailed down and built on for his whole life was the fact that God is a loving parent for all humankind. If you accept this, in my mind, all the rest of the principle is obvious. It's so obvious. If you really understand the implications of God being a parent, we're his children, and he loves everyone as his children. He loves all of humankind equally as his children. That he is a parent with a certain nature, that he created us to reflect his nature, and that this is the original position of parent and child, and we resemble God. If you can connect to what Father revealed in this truth, I think the rest of the story is obvious. The way that God loves us has so many implications that run through American history, the American story. And so therefore, one quote I love from the Bible, Romans 1:20, that God's nature can be clearly seen. This is very clear when you look at nature, and so people really have no excuse. If you look at nature, you can see God's love reflected symbolically in the world around us. If you don't believe in God, and you don't think that that's evidence that God loves us, then, in my opinion, you go up in the mountains and on the rivers and go up, travel around the world and see how beautiful everything is. If that doesn't testify to God's parental love, I just don't know what else I can tell you. We don't really have an excuse. God is a loving parent, and he loves every single person on the earth. And Father understood this so well, and he understood the very central role that this country plays. Because he understood this idea about God being a loving parent, therefore he could understand what America was all about. He came here as a foreigner, and he completely cracked the code on what this, didn't he, Peter?
Yeah.
He understood it better than anybody. Way better than my parents. I grew up, I'm a descendant of the Mayflower. No one ever explained it as clearly as Father. Why? Because Father understands what God's purpose is based upon his parental nature. And Father told us that America is a microcosm of the world, transcending nationality and race. America has created a model. That's pretty heavy, right? We're supposed to be a model for the ideal world. God himself had purposely hidden this land of America from civilization until his time was full. And then upon her, God raised up this model nation that transcends nationality and race. In his providence, God anointed America with oil. He poured out abundant blessing on this land. In short 200 years, God raised up this nation to be the mightiest nation on earth. This is what Father said at Yankee Stadium in 1976. My father did not like Reverend Moon. But when he heard Reverend Moon say this, it blew his mind. He loved Reverend Moon after he heard this because it rang true to his original nature as an American. And this is reflected in paragraph 4 of our family pledge. God's purpose is to build the universal family. Doesn't that mean transcending nationality and race? And perfect the world of freedom, peace, unity, and happiness by centering on true love. America has a central role as a model nation to accomplish God's purpose of creating a universal family. It's a huge task we have here in the United States. I don't see any other country. I could be wrong, but no one's challenged me on this. What other country is trying to build a universal family transcending nationality and race as desperately as we're trying? There's lots of evidence that we're struggling, but that's what we're trying to do here in America. So, Father said that God raised this nation to be the mightiest nation on earth. Somehow, there's a process through which God is taking our country from its European and colonial foundation all the way up in a providential course to fulfilling this purpose as being a model nation. That's profound, isn't it?
Yeah.
That is profound. And how is God doing that? By what process has God been raising this nation? How does he do that? How does he take this country that comes out of a colonial European root and turn it into a universal family? This is not meant to be Europe. This is not meant to be Europe. This is a totally different place than where we came from. And somehow, God has been bringing this country through a process to change us to become a country that reflects being a universal family. Hello? How does that happen? Well, the last time I was here, we talked about this idea that God created America as a place for tribal convergence. He brought the 3 great tribes here after 60,000 years of being separated. We talked about all of humanity coming out of Africa, tribal migration going over a period of 60,000 years, creating all these very profound differences between our tribes, and those tribes reconverging in a continent that Father said was left empty until his time was right, and then he brought the tribes together. He brought the Central Asians here, across the Bering Strait, 13,000 years ago. He brought the Europeans here by boat, 400 years ago, and basically at the same time he brought enslaved African Americans here via what's called the Middle Passage, also 400 years ago. So the Europeans and the Africans have been here for the same amount of time. No one can say that we got here, we had some kind of prior presence. We arrived basically at the same time. Some people came on a boat, other people came in chains. But God sent us to be here together. So these are the three founding tribes, and what's going on in our country is God's attempt to bring this divergence of culture and ethnicity and spirituality together to converge us and to create a universal family, the model nation. Those were Father's words. So we explained last time that this providence has advanced through 4 time periods. Divided foundation period from the creation of the colonies up until the Revolutionary War. Divided nation period from the Revolutionary War up until the Civil War. A prolongation period from the beginning of the Civil War up through the Civil Rights period, the beginning of the Civil Rights period, and then the present era, which I believe began in 1955, or the beginning of the Civil Rights period. I believe we live in the post-Civil Rights era. Our country was totally changed by what happened through the Civil Rights movement. It's never has not been the same since, and it will never be the same again as what happened under the social change that took place with the Civil Rights movement. And within each of these 4 periods, there's been a 5-stage process which unfolds. This is what we talked about last time. Every one of these 4 periods goes through 5 steps. There's a providential leader with a vision. There's a conflict. That vision is actualized into a new institutionalization of freedom, which is a radical change from the past, very challenging, big change, God leading the country forward. There's a reaction against that change and big cultural distortion. Then, to heal this problem and to find a way forward, there's a cultural awakening, and that cultural awakening creates a new social consensus, a new way of thinking, and that allows political change to take place. It allows new providential leadership to emerge, and there's a new period, a new vision, and a new confrontation. That's the process that I believe God is using to push this country from being a bunch of European colonies to become a model nation of the universal family. And so it's happened through 4 time periods, and each time period has had 5 stages, and we talked about this last time. What exactly happened in history to push our country along the way through these 4 different time periods. And we got up to right here, Civil Rights period, and we are now here. We're past there's a new institutionalization of freedom as a result of civil rights, and we're now in a period of reaction, I believe, and cultural distortion. And believe me, we have been here before. The thing that really startled me when I read about what happened during what's called Reconstruction after the Civil War, I was stunned. It's so similar to what's happening right now. It's the same pattern 100 years later. So we're somewhere in between a period of cultural distortion and a period of awakening. Some people think we're cooked. We'll never get out of this mess. I don't think so. That's what people thought before the Civil War. That's what people, it's not the first time that this country's reached an impasse without a clear way forward. So we can see that actually what should have happened when the United States was founded, that everyone was given universal civil rights, there was a 180-year prolongation between what should have occurred at the founding and what actually finally was accomplished through civil rights. What God would have wanted at the founding of our country was what we finally arrived at as a result of the success of the civil rights movement. Does that make intuitive sense to you?
Sure.
So can you see that we lost 180 years by people resisting the providence? We lost almost 2 centuries. You know, history has a way of constantly prolonging itself when there's failures by central figures. So we could say that I was at a conference recently, Braver Angels conference. And this guy said, yep, we've got United States version 1.0. Then we had end of slavery, that was version 2.0, but still no universal suffrage. And then finally now we're at United States 3.0. So what I'm saying is, we should have been, United States 3.0 could have been accomplished here. I'm not saying that, I didn't say that there was a mistake made here. I said there was a mistake made back here during the colonial period. That's where the root of the failure came. But now we've gotten through the civil rights era, and now we're in another period of cultural distortion. Just like after the slaves were free. It's another time of reaction against forward progress and a distortion of our culture. So we've been through this 3 times. After the country was founded, there was a huge disharmony between the people favoring civil rights, especially in the South, and the people that supported the federal government. And it was a very, very tough period. And it actually didn't get resolved until finally there was a civil war, which unified the country. But then, when the slaves were freed, there was another reaction against that. Excuse me, I'm one stage behind. Here's the reaction against Reconstruction, and now we're in a very similar stage, a 4th period of reaction and cultural distortion. So the first of the 5 points I want to make this morning is that we appear now, in my opinion, to be passing through a 4th period of reaction and cultural distortion. And I think we all feel that, right? I know I do. All you have to do is watch CNN tonight, and you'll see it in living color. So what actually is going on? What are the distortions? I would summarize the distortions of the current area like this. I'm not saying this is scientifically correct, but generalizing, because I know, like you do, I spend a ton of time reading the newspaper and watching the news and trying to understand what's going on every single day. We see a radical redefinition of marriage and the family during this period of cultural distortion. We see what I would call, and we're going to talk about this, it's a big issue, white nativism, woke deconstruction, cultural wars. And we see a decline or a weakening of our civic and democratic institutions. We see a loss of confidence in our national future. And we see growing geopolitical threats. I'm not going to talk about this today, it's just too broad a subject. But basically, faltering norms, political extremism and polarization, and national decline, a perceived national decline. That's what's going on in this area of cultural distortion. Why is this happening? What's causing this to happen? What's the reason that our country struggles in this area? The first point I'm going to make, point 2, is a reaction. It's not as simple as this, but the civil rights era changed the culture of this country, and some people are having a hard time with that. Some people are having a hard time processing the profound change that was finally accomplished in our country as a result of the civil rights movement. There was four important laws passed on the foundation of the Civil Rights Movement that put the federal government in charge of administering and enforcing civil rights in our country. The United States administers and enforces civil rights. It's now against the law to discriminate. It's against the law to segregate. It's against the law to prevent people from voting. You cannot do that in this country without, that's a basis for being arrested and going to court and being put in jail, as breaking the laws that were created as a result of the civil rights. Outlawed segregation in businesses, theaters, restaurants, and hotels, banned discrimination in employment, ended segregation in swimming pools, libraries, public schools, required equal access for everyone to vote, eliminated all qualifications for voter registration other than citizenship, outlawed discrimination in housing, provided federal enforcement capability. This was a big change. On the street, when I grew up, there was a state judge, Judge Garrity, and he was the man, as a result of these laws, the judge who had to enforce the integration of public schools in Boston. And there was demonstrations in his house day after day after people hated desegregation. It was a reaction against the change caused by civil rights. I saw it in my own neighborhood when I was growing up, right down the street. He was a federal judge because the federal government has responsibility to enforce civil rights. So, the Civil Rights Acts of 64, 65, and 68 outlawed segregation in hospitality businesses, outlawed segregation in public facilities, ended all barriers to voter registration, and outlawed discrimination in hiring and in housing. Those are huge changes. And again, the federal government was given civil rights, administration, and enforcement responsibility. A lot of people hate the federal government. Why? Because they've been given this authority to push forward what's required to build a model nation of universal right. I'm editorializing here, but to me it's very clear why there's so much anger. There's many reasons that people are fed up with it, but this is one of them. And so there's been a reaction to that. A reaction against the new institutions of freedom. And I believe that reaction is based upon an outmoded worldview. The way of thinking that this is a country for Europeans, that is so out of date with what God is trying to do to create a universal family here. It doesn't fit. Now, I know some of you this is the most controversial part of my talk this morning. Some people are going to be very uncomfortable with the way I'm characterizing this phenomenon. But I believe it's against God's providence to try to retain the hegemony of a culture from Europe in this country. That's not what God is trying to do here. He's trying to create something universal for all people. Who cares what ethnicity they're from? I don't care. I don't have anybody in my family from my ethnicity. Because I learned from our true Father what God wants to do in my family. We get Chinese, Indians, Japanese people in my family. It's great. Because that's what God wants us to do, I think. So here we go. We're in this period of faltering cultural norms, political extremism, institutional decline. The popular expression for this problem of people resisting the change was largely because of civil rights is called nativism. That's a charged term, I know. Some people do not want me to bring up this issue of nativism. But I'm bringing it up because I see what's happened in history. People holding back God's providence, and it's happening again. This is not my term. This is the term that's used in the media. Nativism is an ideology favoring the interests and well-being of the native-born and the long-established residents over newcomers. Do you think that God loves the native-born and long-established residents more than the newcomers? He doesn't. He doesn't. Does he? If he's a loving parent who loves all humankind, I'm not saying people should wander this country illegally. It's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that citizens, all the citizens of this country, deserve the same kind of love from God and the same kind of fairness in our country. So, this nativism, we know all about it. The Proud Boys, Patriot Front, the Oath Keepers. This is from January 6th. I wouldn't be making such a big deal at this point, but I understand what happened after the Civil War, what nativism did. It delayed our province by 90 years. People who could not accept the change that God was putting our country through. And it's happening again. We'll move on from this. You might have heard this idea called replacement theory. This is a specific theory developed by the native-born and the longest-out people about the fact that they feel that they're being replaced socially, politically, economically. They're right. They're being replaced. We're sharing God's blessing with all God's family. Yes, we're all being replaced. I'm being replaced. I believe that the underlying issue here is not racism, it's tribalism. We talked about this last time. That there's healthy aspects of tribalism, but there's also Cain-type or toxic aspects to tribalism. And nativism is a form of tribalism by the people from my tribe. I'm in that tribe. So, second of 5 points. There is a growing tribalistic reaction, which is in the media called nativism, against the profound freedom impacts of civil rights legislation. Our country's not going back. It's not going to go backwards. It's going forwards. And if you react and try to prevent this country from being the kind of country that God wants it to be, you're slowing the advance of God's providence. The third point I'd like to make, and this is the most important point. We know that the Marxist worldview, especially if you studied at UTS with Dr. Ward, the Marxist worldview explains that the nature of our society is determined by the economic base, the means of production and production relations. That determines everything else in the society, which is called the superstructure, which is effect. Economic, materialistic relationships are cause, are subject, and the superstructure is effect. It exists to support the materialistic base. The unification worldview is sort of the opposite of this. The unification worldview says that the base of a society is its spiritual roots, its religious roots, its sense of identity and the values that people hold, and the meaning and the purpose that they ascribe to life and relationships. And based upon the spirituality of a culture, from that develops the superstructure, which is its culture, which is often combined with religion. Religion is often seen as part of the culture. And that yields a certain kind of economics, and that yields a certain kind of politics. But the root or the base of a society is religion or spirituality, not materialistic relationship. This is materialism, this is unification. They're kind of opposite from one another. So, another way of thinking about it in our country is that this is an idea from an author named Joseph Bottom. He says that the United States is like a three-legged stool. It has religion at the base, the core identity of our country. We're going to talk more about what that core is. And that has created a certain kind of economics and a certain kind of politics. This is free market economy. This is representative democracy. And these three legs hold this stool together by leaning up, by supporting each other. Through this long process of providential change, it's being held together by these three legs that support, through this very difficult set of transitions, the country supported by this structure of the stool, but the source of strength is the religious base. And the religious base of this country, and there's really not much debate about this, has been what's called mainline Protestantism. When I read about this, Jews, Catholics, Pentecostals, they'll agree that the core of our culture has come out of what's called mainline Protestantism. The first president of our country that didn't come out of mainline Protestantism was John Kennedy. There's only been 2 Catholic presidents. There's never been a Jewish president. Who's the second Catholic president?
Biden.
Joe Biden. So all of our people who have kind of been the leader of our political life have come out of this mainstream of Protestantism. And that Protestantism actually has a 400-year history. It originally came out of Protestantism against the Anglican Church in England, in Germany, Martin Luther, and it developed outside of Germany under Calvinism, and in England it took the form of Puritanism, and the element of Puritanism that came into our country was Congregationalism. And I grew up as a Congregationalist. The church that I grew up in was a church that came with the Pilgrims out of England. It's now called it's now called UCC, United Church of Christ, because it's part of a bigger group. So there's a long continuity in this country, based upon hundreds of years of history. That's the basis for the spiritual stability and identity of our country. And if you go through this, there's a Puritan awakening in England, and out of that awakening in England came Puritan colonists by tens of thousands. The Puritan migration out of England between 1620 and 1630 was tens of thousands of people came for religious freedom. Huge migration took place. And in that culture of those colonists came what William McLaughlin calls the cultural core and identity of our country, that's been in place ever since that time. Has to do with the rejection of centralized political power, congregational polity, the Protestant work ethic, the sense of millennialism, the idea that we're all autonomous before God, the idea that God gave us inalienable rights, that humans have an opportunity to determine the course of history, government based on consent. These are the core beliefs of our country, and they've been in this country from the very beginning for 400 years. Here's my church, the Wellesley Congregational Church. Beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
That's where I met God. That's why I chose a religious life, because the experience of God that I had as a Protestant was the most powerful experience of my young life. In the main sanctuary of that building is where I created my Protestant identity. And I'm just one. Stephen, what church did you grow up in? Baptist church. Did you go to church most Sundays? Yep. Were you a confirmed member of the Baptist church?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I was a confirmed member. When we were young, that's what American families did, right? We went to church. So we have this Protestant spiritual core. The mainline Protestant churches specifically are the UCC, United Methodists, Evangelical Lutherans, Episcopals, Presbyterians, Baptists, and Disciples of Christ. I mean, this is a widely understood definition of mainline Christianity. And it's very important to note that the spiritual core of our country did not come from one specific church, one specific religious leader. It came from a consensus, a chorus of churches that together created a consensus about the spiritual core of our country. If it was one church, like the Catholic Church, it would have gotten knocked off its high horse a long time ago, but it was a group, a chorus, a consensus of people who believed generally in the same values. And up through the mid-1960s, at least more than 50% of Americans identify themselves, their identity, as being aligned with mainline Protestantism. That's where I came out of. And everyone in my neighborhood, I'm not saying that I'm a typical American, but this is kind of, my story is kind of a classic American story. And the ideology or the worldview of these mainline Protestants is the basis for the long-term social consensus in our country. And that yielded a free market economy where the underlying values are based on what's called consumer sovereignty. That's a big issue in economics that defines the values of our economic system. It's based upon a concept of consumer sovereignty, not producer sovereignty, where the laws support low prices and easy access to supply for consumers. It's very democratic. And democracy. The idea, as stated by Abraham Lincoln, the government is for the people, of the people, and by the people. That comes out of our Protestant spiritual core. The big news, in my opinion, is that mainline Protestantism, for the first time in 400 years, is basically gone. Again, this is not my opinion, this is fact. I mean, it's sociological, it's based upon research. In the middle of the 60s, more than half the U.S. population identified or aligned themselves with mainline Protestantism. Right now, it's somewhere between 10% and 14%. It's fallen off a cliff. You go there, you go to Baptist churches and Methodist churches, when you go into the churches, right, you see what it's like in there, right? They're empty, right? There's no power. That's what I see. Old people doing things like they've done them for the last 50 years. That's not a growing spiritual movement. That's a declining spiritual movement now. Mainline Protestantism is in the rear view mirror. I was at a party, a Halloween party a couple nights ago in my neighborhood, and I said, Protestantism is not coming back. And they were all Protestants and Jews. Pretty much. And they were shocked. They really were upset when I said that. Because they think that Protestantism is going to be revived. I personally don't think that that's where God's providence is going. I don't think so. I could be wrong. There's very low intergenerational retention. Young people aren't going. The average age is my age. Denominations are divided between conservative. You've seen that, right? That's one of the big reasons why Protestantism is failing, is because it's a divided polity. The liberals, and I was at a Brave Rangers meeting yesterday in a church in Harvard Square, extremely liberal Methodist church. A conservative would not be able to go to that church. They wouldn't feel at all comfortable. There's a huge cultural division within Protestantism. There's no witnessing, no commitment to evangelization. And the mainline Protestant church will continue to decline. This is not my opinion. This is based upon research I've done of religious scholars. The decline of mainline Protestantism means that there's a huge loss of social consensus in our country. That's serious. The glue that underlines our culture, our politics, our economics is gone. We've lost the basis for social consensus because of the decline of mainline Protestantism. So this stool is unstable because of the lack of clarity in terms of our religious spiritual foundation. And therefore we have all these problems, confusion over individual identity, national identity, all sorts of diseases, social diseases, let's call them. A decline in civility, a problem with the media, changing social norms, excessive economic inequality, fraud and corruption, and our government's dealing with lots of issues of fraud and corruption. The institutions are becoming weak and they're constantly being challenged and threatened and criticized. And we also are facing a lot of geopolitical threats. In my view, this reflects the fact that the foundational spiritual social consensus of our country has come unglued. It's really not there's a lot of research that says this is what's going on here. So the third point I'm making out of 5 is, and I think this is the most important point today, the dramatic decline of mainline Protestantism has caused a loss of social consensus, and that's resulting in cultural, economic, and political distress and dysfunction. Loss of social consensus. Loss of social consensus. To me, the big issue in this is the problem of identity. Identity. People have lost confidence in who they are, in what's important to them, what they believe in. What about because your identity is not just a matter of being autonomous. Your identity is aligned with all these other aspects of your life. Your identity is connected to the story of your family, the story of your community, the story of your society and nation and world. Your identity is formed by all these different contexts, and this is unclear. So people are struggling over their personal identity, the identity they feel about our country. What does our country stand for? What do we really believe? What are we doing here? What are we doing there? This is there's a kind of an identity crisis as a result of the loss of social consensus. So the fourth point is, okay, so it does appear to be clear that we're in this area of reaction to the changes and social distortion because of a loss of social consensus. Is there going to be a cultural awakening? Is it never going to come? Has it come and gone? Are we right in the middle of it? The specific elements of a spiritual awakening are threefold. This comes out of a book by William McLaughlin, which has been read by a lot of people who are dealing with higher purpose forum right now. It's a great book. A Great Awakening, there's been arguably 3 of them in the country so far, but there's some controversy as to whether there was a Great Awakening in the early 1900s or not. I believe that there was. It might not have been a Great Awakening, but it was a creation of a new social consensus. The first step of a Great Awakening is the emergence of what we call new lights. New lights. Charismatic evangelists, speakers, spiritual leaders who introduce new ways of thinking. People like Sun Myung Moon.
Yeah.
My favorite, New Light. And his wife. And that's the beginning of what's called a spiritual revival. So the point that I'm making here is, a lot of us remember Dr. Young used to say all the time, all we need to do is create a majority. I respectfully do not agree. That is not the way you change this country. You don't have to have the members of your church be 50% of the country. That's not the way it works here. That's not the way you create social consensus that can change the country and allow God to move forward. I believe this is the way God has worked. He sent new lights, spiritual leaders. They've introduced new ways of thinking, new ways of understanding identity, new ways of understanding who we are as Americans, what my responsibility is. New ideas that show the way forward. So please don't talk to me about how great the past was. Please do not glorify the past. Please tell me how we're going to break through and make it. That's the way God thinks, isn't it? Martin Luther King talked about the future. He talked about a beautiful, and people followed him. Father was the same way, right? He had a vision. People who bring a new way of thinking, those are called new lights. And that creates a broad spiritual impact and a new kind of social activism. Starts to have a cultural impact. That's the awakening part. It's based upon a spiritual revival. A much smaller number of people are involved here. This now has social impact, cultural impact. And that slowly leads to the development of a new consensus, bringing a renewal of confidence of the way forward for the country, a functional worldview. So we see this process. You have political and cultural dysfunction. And out of that, God sends new lights, spiritual leaders, and they form new movements, new religious movements. As a result of these new spiritual activity, you begin to see cultural change. This has happened 3 times in our country, so it's a pattern. You can see it. This is not a methodology. This is an observation based upon historical events. And through that, you get a new ideological consensus about the challenges about slavery, or about civil rights, or about women's rights, or about the U.S. responsibility in Europe. You know, different ways of people begin to accept new ways of thinking. And only when you create this ideological consensus, then you can create political change. Spiritual change, cultural expansion, and then finally, the right kind of leaders get elected and make the right kind of political change. If you make political change that isn't based upon a social consensus, you get a mess. You get the French Revolution. You get issue in our country, an issue that where there's no social consensus right now is abortion. So it's been a mess for 50 years because there's no social consensus about the right way to think about abortion. There was political change without consensus, and it doesn't create a way forward. So we see right now there's sort of an ideological vacuum, a need for new light. What is new light? God is not a conservative. Sorry. He's not a conservative. God follows the principle. But he's trying to change the world. He follows the principle. But he's trying to build something for the future. He's not interested in past accomplishment. This is right from Father, isn't it? I mean, I spent a ton of time with Father. I heard him speak hundreds and hundreds of times personally. I traveled with him for 3 years. I saw him every day. So I believe I think I'm speaking representing the principal understanding of spiritual leadership here. God is dissatisfied with the status quo. We're not proud about the status quo in our country. We got a long way to go, right? We got a long way to go. The job is only partially completed. God is looking forward to the fulfillment of his plan. So I met a sister a few months ago at lunch with her, and she started talking about the way that the states used to be set up. It was called state sovereignty or something, and I'm sitting there barely containing my anxiety because she's talking about something in the past that is the way God might have worked, 80 years ago. But God is moving forward. We have to move forward. Our movement has to move forward. God is looking to fulfill the future of his plan. Therefore, he's an innovator, always building, always moving forward to the future. America has a responsibility in God's plan. It's yet to be completed. We're not there yet. Therefore, our country must continuously press forward, always becoming better. Replacement theory. Okay, so the people coming in from other countries can't help us. You're the only people who can really lead our country. New light comes from God to force forward progress in his providence. Changing conditions require God to continuously shed new light on unchanging truth. We used to say the principle is a new expression of truth, right? We didn't say it was new truth. We didn't say it was different than the Christianity. We say there's a new understanding, a higher expression of God's original image. New light. The new light powers personal rebirth, religious renewal, and a departure from corruption. Religious renewal is followed by cultural, social, and political change. It's rooted in religious renewal. Old lights cling to old thinking. I don't think old lights are necessarily evil. I don't feel that way. But they're stuck to old ways of thinking. Old lights cling to old thinking and the status quo, ignoring even persecuting the new lights. We know all about this. We were persecuted. Who persecuted us? Old lights. They don't like new light. It's threatening. It's gone on for hundreds, so it's over and over the same pattern in this country. Old lights cling to old thinking and the status quo, ignoring even persecuting new light. Old lights resist change, and the problem is they're holding back the advance of God's providence. So we have this continuously prolonged history in our country. It's been prolonged way too long. The stubbornness of old lights creates an opportunity for new lights to win over confused people. So there's been several new light attempts already. According to sociological, there have been movements that have tried to create a new social consensus in our country. The first one, major one, is some people called it the Second Reformation. It was a period of social reform in our country after civil rights in the late 60s. It floundered. Then there was a whole movement of the liberalization of Protestantism under the umbrella of the National Council of Churches. There was a whole period that we know well, the nationalist New Right with a moral majority, Pat Robertson, the Christian Coalition. They were trying to create a new social consensus. Remember that phase? There has been an ongoing and international evangelical revival, and this includes both Protestant and Catholics. And there's also a really, really interesting one from the 70s and the 80s. The Unification Church movement. Isn't that what we were trying to do? Really, when Father spoke, he was constantly expecting an awakening, wasn't he? If you look at the end of Father's speeches, many of Father's speeches, they ended, the last two paragraphs were the same. They were about this period of awakening and rebirth of our country and rebirth of Christianity. That's what he thought we were going to accomplish. Each one of these intended to make a fundamental change in our spiritual and cultural, political culture, but none proved capable of doing so. What went wrong with these new light attempts? Two things, in my opinion. But again, this is based upon research. I've read many books about this stuff, and so I'm trying not to just give my opinion, but I've synthesized opinions from the reading that I've done. Exclusivist teachings, not accommodating, not universal enough. Very exclusivist. You come and you don't align with the way they think and what they're like ethnically, you don't feel you fit in. Narrow, inflexible, dogmatic theology, narrow ideas. And a funny eschatology. But by that what I mean is the reasons that evangelicals can't become the basis for a new social consensus is because what they think about the future of the world doesn't at all fit with American eschatology of us they have an apocalyptic sense of the future. That doesn't work. That's not going to become the basis for a social consensus. Does that make sense? Kind of an un-American eschatology. And then also spiritually we're in a very harsh secular environment here in our country. There's profound cultural and ethnic diversity. It's more diverse every day, every week. There's unprecedented religious pluralism, and no religious movement has ever been able to effectively create a broad enough offering to to work within religious pluralism. Brutally secular mass entertainment and media culture, super secular, creating a lot of confusion. And the inertia and indifference of the affluent and powerful status quo. There is a lot of people who don't want anything. Believe me, that's a huge issue in our country. A lot of people don't want anything. They're not interested to change. They are not interested in a universal family in this country because everything is great for them the way it is right now. They want to protect the status quo. So here's the fourth point, next to last point. Numerous movements have attempted new light awakenings, but they've all fallen short. So the last point is we now see in our country a broad proliferation of worldviews. And it's really, really extreme in our country. We have white nationalism, which is kind of hostile to the federal government. We talked about this constant sense of anger towards federal authority. There's white nationalism. We've talked about that, sort of the Proud Boys, the Patriot Front, Oath Keepers. There's Christian nationalism. That's a big, big factor in the landscape. I would say that Marjorie Taylor Greene fits in, I think she would identify with that. I believe Sanctuary Church is a Christian nationalist. They're aligned with groups that are involved with what's called Christian nationalism. Conservatism, Mike Pence, Dennis Prager, Jordan Peterson. I don't know if he would agree to be called a conservative, but it sounds like, when I listen to him, he sounds like a conservative to me. Liberalism, the government can step in and help solve the problems of dysfunction in our country. Joe Biden, Heather Cox Richardson. I had another one here, but I forget who it was. Okay. Progressivism, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Ilhan Omar. Each one of these has a kind of a differing worldview, trying to find a way forward based upon a set of ideas. Democratic socialism, a big movement in this country. They've been in the news recently. They're being fractured by the situation in Gaza and Israel, because among the progressive Democrats, there's people who violently disagree within that group about U.S. policy in Gaza. The Israeli policy in Gaza. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, OAC. I believe Bernie Sanders is a democratic socialist. Some people would say he's not a democratic socialist. And then woke deconstruction. Cancel culture, BLM, 1619 Project. Now, some of you might not agree with the way I'm sorry if this doesn't quite line up with the way you would define the landscape of worldviews in our country, but this is kind of the way, at least, this is my opinion. This is not really based on research. And if you'd like to help me improve this, I'd be happy to hear from you. I'm working on this. I believe unification worldview fits right in here. I do not believe unificationism is a conservative worldview. I think headwing is a blend of male and female, a blend of liberal and conservative, a blend of mind and a blend of, and I think it captures the best elements of conservatism and liberalism. And so we have this beautiful organization, you might have heard about unificationism. It comes out of Korea, but main institutions there, the Family Federation, HJ International, a great graduate school, and of course, Higher Purpose Forum.
Yeah, a little plug.
You're right. Okay, I'm almost finished. So we have, in the effort to create a new spiritual, religious, ideological foundation for our country, we have all these competing ideologies, and it's creating a lack of social consensus, a proliferation of worldviews, and what we call a culture war going on. Who can claim this space and align the rest of the country with their worldview? So in the absence of social consensus, fifth point, in the absence of a social consensus, there has arisen a proliferation of divergent ideologies, resulting in a culture war. So what I've been trying to do here is come up with a way of explaining how all this is developed, by coming up with those 5 points. And summarizing, I believe we're in a fourth period of counter-reaction and cultural distortion. We're seeing a nativist reaction against the impacts of the civil rights legislation. It's broader than that, but it's rooted in the profound change of our culture and advancement of our culture because of civil rights. The loss of consensus, social consensus due to the decline in mainline Christianity. The ineffectiveness of numerous new light attempts. And a clash of proliferating worldviews. So this is like the weather report, and I believe on the basis of these ideas is when you can actually begin to think about what the right way to build a new light movement is, given this weather report, and that would be part 3. Thank you very much.